The cantina fell silent as General HFY entered, her four arms bearing the scars of countless battles across the galaxy. The Keltharian war hero moved slowly, each step deliberate, her reptilian features weathered by decades of conflict. Other patrons, representing dozens of species from across the Galactic Coalition, instinctively made room for her. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone had heard of her victories against the Hive Swarms, the Void Hunters, and the Crystalline Empire. But tonight, something was different about the General. Her usual confident bearing seemed diminished, replaced by what could only be described as unease. She ordered her usual drink, fermented Altarian root extract, and sat alone at her regular corner booth, staring into the amber liquid as if it held answers to questions she feared to ask. It didn't take long for younger soldiers to approach. They always did. The galaxy's veterans were drawn to HFY like metal to a magnet, seeking wisdom from someone who had survived battles that claimed entire fleets. Tonight was no different, except for the shadow that seemed to follow her movements. "General," said Lieutenant Vexdal, a young Zentorian with bright blue skin and eager eyes. "We heard about the latest reports from the Outer Rim. The humans, they've been assigned to our sector." The General's drinking appendage paused halfway to her mouth. Around the booth, the conversation died completely. Even the background chatter from other tables seemed to fade, as if the very mention of humans had sucked the energy from the room. "Humans," she repeated, the word coming out like a prayer to forgotten gods. "Yes, sir," continued Vexdal, oblivious to the change in atmosphere. "Command says they're sending 3 of their ships to reinforce our position at Kepler Station. We're finally going to see what all the fuss is about." Some of the crew are excited to work alongside the famous human warriors. HFY set down her drink with a trembling hand. The younger soldiers leaned in, expecting stories of human heroics, tales of their legendary courage, and innovative tactics that had spread throughout Coalition space like wildfire. Instead, they saw something they had never witnessed before: fear in the eyes of the most decorated general in Coalition history. "Excited," she whispered, then let out a bitter laugh that sent chills through the assembled group. "You have no idea what you're saying." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Commander Thekmore, a grizzled Altarian with cybernetic implants covering half his face, spoke up. "General, with respect, the humans have an impressive service record. Their victories at Titan's Gate and the Proxima Offensive are legendary. Surely working with such allies would be..." Stop. The word came out with such force that several glasses on nearby tables rattled. HFY's 4 eyes, each one a different shade of amber, fixed on the commander with an intensity that made him step backward. "You think you know about humans because you've read battle reports. You think their victories tell the whole story." She stood slowly, her considerable height casting shadows over the assembled soldiers. At nearly 3 meters tall, General HFY was an imposing figure under normal circumstances. Now, with something approaching terror flickering across her features, she seemed almost mythical in her dread. "I was there," she said quietly, her voice carrying despite its softness. "At Titan's Gate. I saw what they did." The younger soldiers exchanged glances. Everyone knew about Titan's Gate. It was one of the Coalition's greatest victories against the Void Hunters. A small human fleet had somehow turned the tide of a battle that was already lost, saving millions of lives and securing a strategically crucial system. It was the kind of victory that made careers and created legends. "I commanded the 3rd Fleet," HFY continued, beginning to pace within the confines of the booth area. 47 ships, including 2 dreadnoughts and my flagship, the Stellar Pride. We've been fighting the Void Hunters for 6 months, pushing them back system by system. Then, they made their stand at Titan's Gate. Her voice took on a distant quality, as if she were seeing events from years past playing out before her eyes. The Void Hunters had fortified the system like nothing we'd ever seen. Orbital defense platforms, minefields, energy barriers that could stop antimatter torpedoes cold. Our intelligence estimated we'd need at least 200 ships to take the system, and even then, casualties would be enormous. But you only had 47, observed Lieutenant Vexdal. 47, confirmed the general. And we were losing badly. The Void Hunters had lured us into a trap. Their fleet was twice the size of what our scouts had reported. Within the first hour of engagement, I'd lost 12 ships, and both dreadnoughts were heavily damaged. I was preparing to order a retreat when they arrived. The humans, breathed Commander Thekmore. ZYXTHRA nodded slowly. 3 ships. That's all. 3 human vessels. A heavy cruiser called Indomitable, a destroyer named Fury, and... She paused, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. A small science vessel called Darwin's Revenge. The absurdity of it struck the assembled soldiers immediately. 3 ships arriving to reinforce a losing battle against overwhelming odds would normally be seen as either a token gesture or a suicide mission. But the looks on their faces suggested they were beginning to understand that something extraordinary had happened at Titan's Gate. At first, I thought Command had sent them by mistake, the general continued. I opened a communication channel to the human commander, a Captain Morrison, to inform him of the situation and suggest he withdraw immediately. I told him we were facing impossible odds, and that 3 ships couldn't possibly make a difference. She paused to take another drink, and the soldiers could see her hands were still shaking slightly. Captain Morrison was quiet for a moment after I explained the situation. Then, he said something I'll never forget. General, you're absolutely right. 3 ships can't win this battle. But we're not here to win it. We're here to end it. The distinction seemed subtle, but something in the general's tone suggested it was anything but. Around the cantina, even conversations at other tables had stopped as patrons strained to hear the war hero's words. I asked him what he meant. ZYXTHRA continued. He just smiled. Humans have this disturbing ability to show their teeth when they're pleased about something, and said, General, with your permission, we'd like to demonstrate a few concepts we've been working on. The general's voice took on a note of growing unease. I had no idea what that meant, but at that point, I was willing to try anything. The Void Hunters were closing in, my fleet was being torn apart, and 3 human ships certainly couldn't make things worse. So I gave them permission to demonstrate their concepts. She fell silent for a long moment, staring into her drink, as if reliving memories she wished she could forget. What happened next? Asked Vexdal, unable to contain his curiosity. ZYXTHRA looked up, and, for the first time since beginning her story, she made direct eye contact with each of the soldiers around her. What happened next, she said slowly, was that I learned why every species in the galaxy should be very, very careful about what they wish for when it comes to human assistance. The cantina had become so quiet that the only sound was the gentle hum of the air recycling systems. Even the bartender, a massive Gorelian with 6 arms, had stopped cleaning glasses to listen. The first thing the humans did was ask for our tactical data, the general continued. Complete sensor readings on every Void Hunter ship, their positions, energy signatures, defensive capabilities, everything we had. I transmitted it immediately, assuming they wanted to coordinate their attack with ours. She let out another bitter laugh. Coordinate. As if anything the humans do could be called coordination with normal military tactics. What did they do with the data? Commander Thekmore asked. They fed it into something they called an adaptive warfare algorithm, ZYXTHRA replied. The science vessel, Darwin's Revenge, apparently wasn't just carrying research equipment. It was carrying a computer system more advanced than anything in our fleet combined. Within 10 minutes, they had analyzed every aspect of the enemy formation and developed what Captain Morrison called targeted solutions. The phrase targeted solutions seemed to hang in the air like a threat. I should have asked more questions, the general admitted. But we were running out of time, and frankly, I was desperate. The Void Hunters were preparing for their final assault, and I was looking at the complete destruction of my fleet. So when Captain Morrison requested permission to implement the solutions, I gave it without hesitation. She paused again, and the soldiers could see she was struggling with what came next. The first thing that happened was that the human science vessel launched what looked like a standard probe array, she continued. Dozens of small devices, spreading out through the battlefield like seeds in the wind. I assumed they were collecting additional data, or perhaps preparing to jam enemy communications. But they weren't, ventured Lieutenant Vexdal. No, confirmed ZYXDRA. They weren't. Those probes were what humans call smart minds. Each one was equipped with a miniature AI, programmed to analyze any ship that came within range and determine the most effective way to destroy it. But that wasn't the frightening part. She stood and began pacing again, her forearms gesturing as she spoke. The frightening part was that these minds didn't just explode when they found a target. They learned. Each time one detonated, it transmitted data back to the others, improving their targeting algorithms, their approach patterns, their detonation timing. By the time the Void Hunter fleet realized what was happening, the minds had become exponentially more effective. The implications of what she was describing began to sink in among the listening soldiers. Weapons that improved themselves during combat represented a level of technological sophistication that bordered on the terrifying. But that was just the beginning, ZYXDRA continued. While the minds were adapting to the enemy fleet, the human destroyer Fury was implementing what Captain Morrison called behavioral modification protocols. Behavioral modification? Asked Commander Thekmore. The general nodded grimly. The humans had analyzed our tactical data and determined that the Void Hunters were using predictable formation patterns based on their species' psychological makeup. So they began transmitting specific electromagnetic frequencies designed to exploit weaknesses in Void Hunter neurochemistry. The cantina had become completely silent except for the general's voice. Even species that were normally incapable of experiencing fear seemed affected by her words. Within minutes, the entire Void Hunter fleet began showing signs of what human military psychologists call induced tactical paranoia, she continued. Ships started breaking formation, firing on their own allies, retreating from positions they should have held. The humans had essentially driven them insane, using nothing but precisely calibrated radio waves. The horror of what she was describing wasn't lost on anyone present. The idea that humans had developed weapons that could affect the minds of their enemies suggested a level of understanding of alien psychology that was both impressive and deeply disturbing. And while this was happening, Ethra said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, the heavy cruiser Indomitable was preparing to demonstrate what Captain Morrison called the final solution. The phrase sent chills through the assembled soldiers. In their experience, any military strategy described as a final solution was rarely something they wanted to witness firsthand. But as the general opened her mouth to continue her tale, the lights in the cantina flickered, and an announcement echoed through the space station's communication system. Attention, all personnel. Human fleet vessels Indomitable, Fury, and Darwin's Revenge have arrived in system and are requesting docking clearance. The blood drained from General Zextara's face as she realized that the very ships from her story and the humans who crewed them had just arrived at their station. The station announcement echoed through the cantina like a death knell, and General Zextara's four hands began to shake visibly. Around her, the younger soldiers looked confused by her reaction. These were supposed to be reinforcements, allies coming to help defend the sector. Why did their arrival seem to terrify the most decorated war hero in Coalition space? General, Lieutenant Vexdal said carefully, should we not be pleased that such renowned ships have arrived to assist us? Vyextara turned to look at him, and the young Zentorian stepped backward involuntarily. The general's amber eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of witnessing things that defied comprehension. You want to know what the Indomitable did at Titan's Gate? She asked quietly. You want to understand why the mere mention of these ships makes veteran commanders across the galaxy request immediate transfers to other sectors? The soldiers nodded, though their enthusiasm had been replaced by growing apprehension. The heavy cruiser moved into position above the largest Void Hunter dreadnought. The Wyextara continued, her voice taking on the distant quality of someone reliving a nightmare. This was their flagship, a massive vessel nearly 4 kilometers long, protected by energy shields that could deflect the combined firepower of my entire fleet. She paused to take another drink, noticing that her glass was now nearly empty. The alcohol seemed to have no effect on the tremor in her hands. Captain Morrison contacted me again, she continued. He said, "General, we're about to demonstrate human problem-solving methodology. You might want to record this for your tactical databases." I thought he was planning some kind of concentrated weapons barrage, maybe using exotic munitions we hadn't seen before. Commander Thekmore leaned forward. "But that's not what happened." "No," confirmed the general. "What happened was that the Indomitable launched a single object toward the Void Hunter flagship. Not a missile, not a torpedo, not any kind of weapon I could identify. Just a small metallic sphere about the size of a person's fist." The description seemed almost anticlimactic after the build-up, and several soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. "I watched this sphere approach the dreadnought," HFY continued. "The Void Hunters ignored it completely. Their sensors probably classified it as debris or a sensor probe. It passed through their shields without triggering any defensive systems and made contact with their hull." "And then?" asked Vexdal. The general's voice dropped to a whisper. "And then nothing happened. For exactly 37 seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The sphere just sat there on the enemy hull while the battle continued around it. I started to think it was a malfunction, that whatever the humans had planned had failed." She stood again and walked to the cantina's main viewport, looking out at the stars beyond the station. In the distance, 3 ships were approaching, sleek vessels with a distinctive angular design of human military architecture. "On the 38th second," she said without turning around, "that 4-kilometer dreadnought simply ceased to exist." The silence that followed was complete. Even the ambient noise of the station's systems seemed to pause in response to her words. "Ceased to exist," Commander Thekmore repeated slowly. HFY nodded. "Not destroyed, not exploded, not vaporized. It simply wasn't there anymore." Where the largest, most heavily armed vessel in the Void Hunter fleet had been, there was now empty space. No debris, no energy signature, no trace that it had ever existed at all. The implications of what she was describing began to sink in among the assembled soldiers. A weapon that could make matter simply disappear represented technology so far beyond their understanding that it barely seemed possible. "I demanded an explanation from Captain Morrison," the general continued. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "General, we've been experimenting with controlled manipulation of quantum vacuum states. That sphere contained a device that convinced the universe that the space occupied by that ship was actually empty." Several of the younger soldiers looked lost by the explanation, but Commander Thekmore's cybernetic implants flashed as he processed the information. "He's describing reality manipulation," he said slowly. "They didn't destroy the ship. They convinced physics that it had never been there in the first place." "Exactly," confirmed HFY. "And when I asked him how such technology was possible, Captain Morrison said something that still haunts me. General, humans have always been very good at changing the rules when the existing ones don't suit our purposes." She turned back to face the group, and they could see that her terror had deepened rather than lessened as she continued her story. "But that wasn't the end," she said. "With their flagship gone, the remaining Void Hunter vessels began a chaotic retreat. They were scattered, confused, many of them still suffering from the psychological warfare effects. A normal military force would have been content to let them flee and count the victory as complete. But the humans weren't content, observed Lieutenant Vexdal. "The humans," HFY said with a bitter laugh, "were just getting started." Captain Morrison contacted me again and said, "General, we've identified several ships in the retreating fleet that have been flagged as having committed war crimes against civilian populations. With your permission, we'd like to implement our justice protocols." The phrase justice protocols seemed to carry the same ominous weight as the earlier references to solutions and demonstrations. "I should have said no," the general admitted. "I should have told them that we had rules of engagement that retreating enemies were not to be pursued beyond the system boundary, that we followed the galactic conventions on warfare. But I was still in shock from witnessing that dreadnought simply vanish, and frankly, I was curious about what humans consider justice. She began pacing again, her movements becoming more agitated as she continued. The destroyer Fury moved to intercept the retreating vessels, she said. But instead of firing weapons, it began broadcasting on all frequencies. The transmission was in perfect Void Hunter dialect, and it said, "Vessels designated as war crime perpetrators, you are hereby sentenced to face the consequences of your actions. Sentence will be carried out by your own victims." Commander Thekmore's implants flashed again as he processed this information. Their own victims? But the civilians they had killed were dead. ZYXR nodded grimly. That's what I thought too, until I saw what the humans meant by consequences. The Fury began projecting holographic images around each of the designated Void Hunter ships. Perfect three-dimensional recreations of every civilian they had killed in their raids against defenseless colonies. The horror of what she was describing began to register with the assembled soldiers. Several took involuntary steps backward, as if trying to distance themselves from the implications of her words. These weren't just random images, the general continued. Each hologram was perfectly accurate, showing the exact moment of each victim's death, playing out the final moments of thousands of innocent lives. And as these images surrounded their ships, the Void Hunter crews began to break down. Break down how? Asked Vexdal, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The humans had studied Void Hunter psychology extensively, Zwixthera explained. They knew that this species experienced guilt in a fundamentally different way than most others, that being confronted with the reality of their actions could trigger what humans called cascading psychotic episodes. She paused at the viewport again, watching the approaching human ships with obvious dread. Within minutes, the crews of 7 Void Hunter vessels had suffered complete mental breakdowns, she continued. They began firing their weapons randomly, sometimes at the holograms, sometimes at their own ships, sometimes at empty space. 3 ships actually self-destructed as their crews became convinced they were being attacked by the ghosts of their victims. The cantina had become a tomb of silence. Even the hardened veterans among the patrons seemed shaken by the general's description of events. And the humans just watched, Zwixthera said, her voice carrying a note of disgust. Captain Morrison explained that they called it natural consequences enforcement, that they weren't directly harming the enemy, merely ensuring that they faced the psychological reality of their own actions. But that's... Commander Thekmore began, then trailed off as he realized there wasn't an adequate word for what he was trying to express. Exactly, the general confirmed. It's something beyond conventional warfare. The humans had turned guilt and regret into weapons, used the enemy's own consciences against them. And when I asked Captain Morrison if this was standard human military doctrine, he said something that still gives me nightmares. She turned to face the assembled soldiers again, and they could see that her fear had transformed into something approaching terror. He said, "General, this is what we do when we're being merciful. You really don't want to see what happens when we decide to stop showing restraint." As if summoned by her words, the communication system crackled to life again. This time, the voice that came through was unmistakably human, crisp, professional, and carrying an undertone of barely contained power. "Station Control, this is Captain Morrison aboard the Indomitable. We're requesting permission to dock and meet with General Zwixthera to discuss sector defense protocols. We have some new concepts we'd like to demonstrate." The general's face went completely pale as she recognized the voice from her nightmares. Around her, the younger soldiers began to understand why their arrival had triggered such fear in their commander. These weren't just allies coming to help defend the sector. These were humans coming to demonstrate their concepts. And if General Viscera's story was any indication, the galaxy was about to learn why even the most decorated war heroes feared the sound of human laughter and the phrase, "We have some ideas we'd like to try." Outside the viewport, The three human ships continued their approach, their sleek forms cutting through space with predatory grace. Somewhere aboard those vessels, minds that had turned physics itself into a weapon were undoubtedly developing new solutions, new demonstrations, new concepts to share with their alien allies. And, in the cantina, the most feared military commander in Coalition space stood frozen with the knowledge of what was coming, unable to warn her fellow soldiers of the true nature of human assistance without sounding like she had lost her mind. The humans had arrived, and they had ideas. The docking bay of Kepler Station had never felt so ominous. General Extra stood at the observation deck above the primary landing pad, watching as the human vessels maneuvered into their assigned positions with unsettling precision. The indomitable Fury and Darwin's Revenge moved like predators stalking prey, their movements too smooth, too calculated for normal military vessels. Behind her, nearly the entire senior staff of the station had gathered to witness the arrival of their famous human reinforcements. The excitement in the room was palpable. Officers from dozens of species chattering excitedly about finally meeting the legendary warriors whose exploits had become the stuff of military folklore across the galaxy. General, called Admiral Korath, the station commander, approaching with obvious enthusiasm. This is quite an honor. Captain Morrison's tactical innovations are studied at the War College on 3 different worlds. Having him here to help plan our defense against the Nexus Syndicate is a tremendous advantage. ZYXRA didn't respond immediately. She was too busy watching the docking procedures, noting details that others missed. The human ships didn't just dock. They seemed to interface with the station's systems at a level that suggested they were already beginning to map and analyze every aspect of Kepler Station's operations. "Admiral," she said finally, "I need to speak with you privately about these reinforcements." But before Korath could respond, the docking bay doors sealed with a definitive hiss, and the atmosphere processors hummed to life. Within minutes, the first human personnel began emerging from their ships. Captain Morrison stepped out first, and ZYXRA felt her breath catch in her throat. He looked exactly as she remembered, unremarkably average by human standards, with dark hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything they encountered. He wore the standard blue and gray uniform of the human colonial navy, but something about the way he carried himself suggested that uniforms and regulations were merely conveniences rather than actual constraints. Following Morrison came his senior staff, Commander Sarah Chun from the Fury, a small woman whose pleasant smile somehow made Extra's skin crawl, and Dr. Marcus Webb from the Darwin's Revenge, whose appearance was so perfectly ordinary that it felt deliberately crafted to be forgettable. "They look so normal," whispered Lieutenant Vexdal, who had joined the observation group despite Extra's earlier warnings. "That's part of what makes them terrifying," the general replied quietly. "They've weaponized normalcy itself." Below them, Captain Morrison was greeting Admiral Korath with perfect military courtesy. His gestures were appropriate, his tone respectful, his demeanor exactly what one would expect from a visiting Allied officer. To anyone observing, this appeared to be a routine diplomatic meeting between coalition forces. But ZYXRA noticed the subtle details that others missed. The way Morrison's eyes tracked the position of every security camera in the bay. How Commander Chen's casual glance at the ceiling revealed her cataloging the structural weak points of the station. The manner in which Dr. Webb's seemingly random movement pattern had allowed him to scan the entirety of the docking bay's layout. "Admiral Korath," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying clearly through the observation deck's audio pickups. "Thank you for accommodating our arrival. We're eager to contribute to the sector's defense preparations." "The pleasure is ours, Captain," Korath replied enthusiastically. "Your reputation precedes you. The entire command staff is looking forward to learning from your tactical expertise." Morrison smiled, that disturbing display of human teeth that ZYXRA remembered all too well. "We have developed some interesting new approaches that we think you'll find educational." The word educational seemed to hang in the air with the same ominous quality as Morrison's earlier references to demonstrations and solutions. But Admiral Korath appeared oblivious to the undertones, continuing to beam with pleasure at hosting such renowned guests. General Vexera is here as well, Korath continued, gesturing toward the observation deck. I believe you two have worked together before. Morrison looked up toward the observation windows, and his eyes found Vexera immediately despite the glare and the crowd of officers surrounding her. When their gazes met, his smile widened slightly, and he offered a casual wave that somehow felt like a threat. General Vexera, Morrison called out, his voice somehow carrying perfectly to her position despite the distance and intervening barriers. How wonderful to see you again. I hope you've had time to review the tactical analyses we transmitted from Titan's Gate. We've made some fascinating improvements since then. The blood drained from Zuaxthara's face as she realized the implications of his words. Improvements. They had taken the reality-warping weapons and psychological warfare techniques she had witnessed and made them better. Admiral, she said urgently, grabbing Korath's arm, I need to speak with you immediately, privately. But before the Admiral could respond, Morrison's voice came through the communication system again, this time addressing the entire station. Attention, all personnel, he announced with the same pleasant tone one might use to discuss the weather. In the interest of optimizing our defensive preparations, my team will be conducting a comprehensive analysis of station operations over the next few hours. This will include detailed scans of all systems, personnel evaluations, and strategic capability assessments. Please continue your normal duties. You won't even notice we're watching. The casual mention of watching sent chills through every officer on the observation deck, but Admiral Korath still seemed pleased by the human's thoroughness. Excellent initiative, Captain, he replied. We'll provide you with full access to all station systems and databases. That won't be necessary, Morrison responded, and Zuaxthara could hear the amusement in his voice. We've already established the connections we need. The implications of this statement began to register with some of the more technically minded officers on the observation deck. Commander Thekmore's cybernetic implants flashed rapidly as he processed what Morrison had just admitted. General, he whispered urgently, he's saying they've already hacked our systems. During the docking procedure, they must have infiltrated everything, Zuaxthara finished grimly. Communications, security, life support, tactical databases. In the time it took them to dock, they've probably gained complete access to every system on this station. The realization was spreading through the observation deck as officers began to understand the true nature of their situation. They weren't hosting allies. They were being quietly invaded by beings whose understanding of technology and warfare operated on levels that made conventional military thinking obsolete. Admiral, Alexthera said more urgently, you need to understand what these humans are capable of. They don't follow the normal rules of engagement. They don't think like us. She was interrupted by Dr. Webb's voice coming through the communication system, speaking with the calm tone of someone delivering a routine scientific report. Captain Morrison, I've completed the preliminary analysis of station personnel. Psychological profiles indicate optimal conditions for implementing Behavioral Modification Protocol 7. Stress patterns suggest the crew is primed for acceptance of new command structures. The observation deck fell silent as the officers began to understand that they were being analyzed like laboratory specimens. Their psychological states were being assessed, their vulnerabilities cataloged, their likelihood of accepting human authority being calculated in real time. Excellent, Dr. Webb, Morrison replied. Commander Chun, what's your assessment of the station's defensive capabilities? Primitive, but functional, came the response from the human destroyer commander. Standard coalition technology, approximately 15 years behind current human development. Easily upgraded using our enhancement protocols. I'm detecting several structural inefficiencies that could be optimized. When she says optimized, Zuaxthara said quietly to the assembled officers, she means restructured according to human specifications. They're not here to work with our existing defenses. They're here to replace them entirely. Admiral Korath finally seemed to be grasping the situation, his enthusiasm rapidly transforming into concern. "General, are you suggesting that these reinforcements represent some kind of threat?" Before Zaxara could answer, Captain Morrison's voice came through the speakers again, this time with a quality that suggested he was aware of their conversation despite the observation deck being theoretically secure. "General Zaxara," he said pleasantly, "since you're already briefing the Admiral on our capabilities, perhaps you'd like to join us for a more detailed discussion? We have some new concepts we developed specifically with your previous concerns in mind." The phrase "previous concerns" carried implications that made Zaxara's four hands clench into fists. Morrison was referring to her reports following Titan's Gate, documents that had recommended extreme caution in future operations involving human forces. Reports that had apparently been read, analyzed, and used as the basis for developing new approaches. "You see," Morrison continued, his voice taking on an almost lecture-like quality, "we've been thinking about the feedback from Titan's Gate, and we realized that our methods might have seemed somewhat overwhelming to our coalition partners. So we've developed more subtle approaches." Commander Chin's voice joined the conversation. "The new protocols focus on integration rather than domination. Instead of replacing existing command structures, we simply influence them, make them more efficient, help them reach their full potential." Dr. Webb added his contribution with scientific detachment. "Preliminary behavioral analysis suggests that Kepler station personnel will adapt to the new operational parameters within 72 hours. Resistance factors are within acceptable ranges." The officers on the observation deck were beginning to understand that they weren't witnessing a military briefing. They were listening to the humans discuss their conquest of the station as if it were a foregone conclusion. And the most terrifying part was how casual they were about it, how they discussed taking control of an entire military installation with the same tone they might use to plan a maintenance schedule. "Admiral," Zaxara said desperately, "you need to order an immediate lockdown. Cut their access to station systems, confine them to the docking bay, contact Coalition Command for guidance on how to handle this situation." But even as she spoke, she could see in Koratha's eyes that it was already too late. The Admiral's expression had taken on a glazed quality that suggested he was already being influenced by whatever psychological manipulation techniques the humans were employing. "I don't think that's necessary, General," Korath replied with artificial calm. "Captain Morrison and his team are here to help us. Their suggestions for optimizing our operations sound quite reasonable." Zaxara realized with growing horror that the humans had been implementing their subtle approaches from a moment they had established communication with the station. Whatever Dr. Webb's behavioral modification protocol 7 involved, it was already being applied to the senior staff. "General," Morrison's voice came through the speakers one final time, "why don't you come down to the docking bay? We have so much to discuss. After all, we're going to be working together very closely from now on." The invitation carried the weight of an inevitability rather than a request. Around her, the other officers were already beginning to move toward the exits, their expressions showing the same artificially calm acceptance that had overtaken Admiral Korath. Only Zaxara seemed immune to whatever influence the humans were exerting, perhaps because she had witnessed their capabilities before and understood the true nature of what was happening. She stood alone on the observation deck, watching as the most heavily fortified station in the sector quietly surrendered itself to 3 human ships and their terrifyingly innovative crews. The humans had arrived with promises of assistance and demonstrations of new concepts. But what they were actually implementing was something far more sophisticated than conquest. They were providing an education in just how completely a superior intelligence could reshape reality to suit its purposes. And the lesson was just beginning.